Thu tvide gesælig. Our presentation is going to focus on the Old English adjective gesælig, more specifically in prose, and it attempts to characterize its semantic properties within the lexical field of holiness.
The lexical field of holiness, as it is defined in the Thesaurus of Old English, contains these 5 adjectives, as you can see here: je blädsod, gasthali, je halgod, hali, and gesælig. The ultimate aim of our research is to define the properties of each member of the field. We have previously conducted research for the adjective hali, which in fact was presented at this university in November 2019. This presentation, however, only focuses on the last of the adjectives, gesælig, the modern-day silly.
Our research started by looking into the dictionaries of Old English. The Bosworth-Toller Dictionary of Old English lists the following meanings: happy, prosperous, blessed, and fortunate, with their Latin translation equivalents: felix, beatus, and fortunatus. As we can see, gesælig is not only a member of the lexical field of holiness, but also of the lexical field of happiness. We decided not to ignore the meaning of happiness, since there is a considerable overlap, as will become clearer later in the presentation. Unfortunately, the Dictionary of Old English has no entry for gesælig as of yet. The letter S is not yet edited, as the prefix je is not obligatory and the version of the word with it is not listed separately.
Our methodology was to firstly look up all the instances of gesælig in the YCOE corpus using the interface of the Czech national corpus, called context. Our complicated query can be seen here. The query has produced a total of 125 hits. Based on the relatively low number, we decided to conduct a manual analysis of each instance. Firstly, we divided the instances into predicative and attributive uses, and we then identified the conceptual fields of the adjective. And lastly, we identified who or what is the source of the quality of holiness or blessedness or happiness.
In other words, we are comparing the predicative and attributive functions, trying to see whether they differ in their meaning and whether they are associated with the same conceptual fields. Conceptual fields refer to the classification of the entities that are assigned the property of the adjective. In other words, we looked at who or what is described as being gesælig, and then we divided these into groups based on their semantic properties. For the purposes of our analysis, we used 2 equations. One for the predicative use, equation S, in which X refers to the entity that is gesælig, that is the subject of the sentence, and BE, that is the copular verb, väsan, beon, and värsan. And a second equation for the attributive use, NP, where the N refers to the noun that is modified by gesælig, and the lowercase x stands for an optional determiner. For each entity, we furthermore identified the source of holiness, blessedness, potentially also happiness, something that proved worth investigating when analyzing Harlig. We were also interested in the types of text gesæligs appeared in to find out whether it is genre specific. As we have mentioned, we eventually intend to examine all of the members of the lexical field of holiness, and we expect them to differ in their frequency, distribution, religious connotation, and the source of holiness.
As always, when performing any sort of analysis, one does tend to run into some problems. Quite commonly, the subject, or the X, was a pronoun or a general noun, which meant that we had to look at a much broader context in order to determine who it refers to. In the first example, the entity described as gesælig is der hyrde, a shepherd, and it is not clear whether that refers to Jesus or some kind of a priest. In example 2, the subject is the pronoun he, which, after some reading, turned out to be Saint Servulus. Another problem were instances with non-copular verbs, such as rixian, wunian, and sidian. In some cases, it could not be determined with certainty whether gesælig here is an adjective or an adverb. Do they rule happy in heaven, or do they rule happily? The ending e allows for both interpretations equally. However, as these do not fit into our equations, we have decided to leave them out of the analysis for now.
There we come to the part of the presentation where we introduce the actual results of the analysis. As mentioned, the number of hits was 125 with the IPM of 76.21, out of which 14 instances ended up being excluded, either because they contained the previously mentioned non-compular verbs or because they were for some reason impossible to interpret, for example due to unclear syntax. From what remained, we identified 81 instances of predicative use of gesælig and 30 of attributive use.
Starting with the attributive use, we found 6 main conceptual fields: people, which includes all nouns denoting human beings or groups of human beings when alive; then teaching, which includes all nouns denoting religious teaching or objects, such as books used to teach the followers of the religion; then time, that includes all nouns referring to a period of time; and place, logically includes all nouns referring to places; spiritual entities, this includes all nouns referring to a soul of a human being; and final category, characteristics, which includes all nouns denoting emotions or states of human life. The first field, people, the one most represented, was divided further into subcategories, to men, women, groups, children, and then unspecified.
The conceptual fields of the predicative gesælig were similar. The most frequent gesælig entities were people, but there were also 2 new fields: animals, which not surprisingly includes all nouns denoting animals, and body, which includes all nouns referring to the body of a human being as a whole or any part of it. However, some conceptual fields were not found at all. For example, teaching.
Comparing the two, we can see both differences and similarities. As expected, in both cases, gesælig mostly refers to people. The quality of blessedness, holiness, or happiness is something that is inherently connected with people rather than objects. However, there is a difference in whether these are specific individuals or whether we are talking about people generally. As we can see, the predicative use is most associated with the unspecified person. Basically, most of the sentences were something along the lines of, "He who follows the law of God is blessed," a sort of conditioned blessedness. On the other hand, in the attributive use, gesælig referred mostly to specific people, for example, saints or bishops. We even found a good number of instances with women and children. However, we expected women and children to be even more represented than they are, given the later development of the word gesælig in Middle English, when the adjective came to be associated with the meaning of inherent innocence or not knowing sin. The medieval patriarchal society attributed this meaning mainly to women and children.
Looking at the source of the quality of blessedness, this starts to make sense since gesælig refers to the inherent quality very rarely but rather represents the concept of luck, being lucky, in other words, being blessed by favorable circumstances. And then it also represents mainly blessedness which has to be earned, in our chart labeled as merit. It is not surprising that this merit is found predominantly in the predicative meaning, since it lists instances of unspecific direction to blessed life, as mentioned in the previous slide. Surprisingly, despite the fact that the word is defined as meaning happy, primarily by the dictionaries, it seems that it is barely ever used to mean happiness in terms of the emotional state. The reason for this can be based on the genre of the text in which the word appears, as will be addressed later. Anyway, unlike some modern translators who routinely translate gesælig as happy, we would suggest that the translation blessed or fortunate would be more fitting, at least for the instances where the source of blessedness can be identified as merit or circumstances. The question arises, what to do in cases which are labelled as miscellaneous or as epithet.
While in some cases the source of holiness was rather clear, even explicitly described in the sentence itself, a number of the instances turned out to be ambiguous. These were classified as miscellaneous. It is in these cases, these bridging contexts, that the reanalysis of the meaning of the adjective can occur, but it can make analysis difficult. For example, as we've said, gesælig was quite commonly used to refer to saints, bishops, or kings. And here it can be quite difficult to determine whether gesælig is used as a mere epithet or whether it is meant to highlight the fact that they deserve this blessedness, or whether they are somehow inherently blessed due to their status. It is here that we start to question whether we are still doing linguistic research or whether we have wandered too far into the territory of theology.
To illustrate this, here are two examples of such ambiguous cases. In 4, gesælig is used with a female scent, Lucia. Is she inherently blessed due to her purity? Did she deserve the description through her conduct? Or is it a mere convention to describe saints as gesælig? In 5, the source is similarly unclear. Were they gifted with the wisdom, or did they deserve it? Either way, the state of blessedness comes from an untied source, leading us to choose the meaning of luck, fortune, and blessedness over happiness in the translation. Frequently, gesælig appears together with other adjectives, such as earlig, with which it shares much of its meaning. Therefore, it may be worth adding it to the lexical field of holiness for further analysis.
So, how does gesælig fit into the lexical field? And can we actually claim anything? Unfortunately, it is not so easy. Now we come to the issue of the text type. As mentioned above, some of the meanings can be predominant due to the text types in which the word appears. As we can see, gesælig is represented mainly in homilies, biographies of saints, and in philosophy. This means two things. Gesælig does indeed seem to be genre-specific, but this is not surprising, given what kind of literature was written at that time and who the authors were.
Now we come to the point where we have the results for two members of the field, holy and gesælig, allowing for comparison of the two in terms of the conceptual field, the source of the quality, and text type. It turned out that after analyzing gesælig, we came to see some of the results in holy in a different light. We expect to continue refining our findings as we investigate the other remaining members of the lexical field. On this slide, we see a comparison of the conceptual fields. Who is described as holy and gesælig? We divided the predicative and attributive uses as well. The pinkish color shows the conceptual fields they have in common. As you can see, the two adjectives do not differ significantly in the conceptual fields, though one may note that they do differ significantly in their frequency, especially in the attributive use. The biggest difference is that gesælig does not appear with deities, which are conceptual fields that consist of such concepts as God, Jesus, the Holy Trinity, etc., and rites, which refer to mass, bread, wine, a chalice, etc. This may indicate that the difference between the two adjectives lies mainly in the source of holiness.
We can see that here in the attributive use quite clearly. In the case of Harley, the quality nearly always comes from God, or from God with an intermediator. That would refer to a figure such as a priest who performs a baptism or something along those lines. In case of gesælig, the source is God only quite rarely. We did decide to set Jesus aside, as these were cases which were specifically connected to his life. Theologically speaking, we mean Jesus of Nazareth rather than Jesus Christ.
The difference is even more pronounced in the predicative use, as you can see here. In Harley, the pagan source of holiness was slightly more represented. These instances still come from Christian texts, but Harley was used to refer to something that pagans considered holy. This holiness was then refuted in the text.
Lastly, we decided to see whether gesælig and Harley appear in different texts, which might account for the differences. However, as you can see, they do seem to be represented in mostly the same text types. We can say that both adjectives are rather genre-specific.
Since we came across the adjective eadig so often, we decided to make the same comparison. The difference is not very pronounced here either. However, we may know the genre of philosophy is more prominent in gesælig. The manual analysis of the instances of both eadig and gesælig in this category shows that the sentences are in both cases only from De Consolatione Philosophiae, written by Boethius and translated into Old English. This may indicate that it was this translator, possibly Alfred the Great himself in particular, that preferred gesælig over eadig or other options. In other words, the use of gesælig in the field of philosophy does not prove this preference to be a general tendency.
The story continues. As we have mentioned in the beginning, the ultimate aim of our work is to map the entire lexical field of holiness. Therefore, the next step is to look at the remaining adjectives, that is, gehelgot and gebledzot. In addition, the analysis of gesælig brought up the need to analyze the word eadig as well, as we have mentioned previously. Afterwards, we would also like to look at the adjectives of this lexical field when preceded by the negative prefix un, or when used in compounds. Also, the influence of the Latin lexical field of holiness should be investigated. Much of the texts from the Old English period are translations, and the authors of texts written in Old English will have been used to reading Latin texts and could be influenced even when writing original work. Currently, we are working on the development of a parallel Old English and Latin corpus, which should prove useful in this endeavor. Finally, the analysis can then be extended to Middle English and also to other Germanic languages contemporary with Old English, such as Old Norse or Old Saxon.
The last slide shows a list of the literature used in our research. With this slide, we would like to thank you for listening, and we are looking forward to the discussion at the conference.